So, in contrast to the indigenous land claim that gives us Nunavut, the second example of a contemporary land claim, a contemporary comprehensive claim we're going to look at, is the Nisga'a Claim out of British Columbia. And the Nisga'a sort of made a claim and argued that their traditional territory, which was unceded and that they did not have a treaty, although they had been asking for one for about a century, um, laid claim to about 75% of the province of British Columbia, including the entirety of the city of Vancouver. And as far as it goes, this is a very different sort of context in terms of whether or not there's competition for that land, right? It's relatively simple for the federal government to hand over Nunavut to governance of largely indigenous people because, hey, they're the ones who live there most of the time anyway. And we don't have sort of competing development priorities, that sort of thing, in most of Nunavut. The Nisga'a claim is quite different because, for example, there's the whole question about all of the value that is produced by the fisheries on the west coast through the Fraser River, through fruit, wine in the Okanagan, through all kinds of forestry. This land is doing something different for the governments, both of British Columbia and in Ottawa. So there was a very different sort of approach to this particular settlement. This one again took a really, 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 really long time to negotiate. The Nisga'a started asking for a treaty like before 1900 and didn't get an agreement in principle until 1996. It took a very, very long time for that to sort of work out. And if we sort of look at the conversations in terms of what this actually looks like, what you will notice is when you look at the terms of the Nisga'a settlement is that very, 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 very quickly the terms the Nisga'a negotiated are very different from everywhere else. So, for example, that agreement in principle contains an initial payment of $500 million to the Nisga'a sort of governance structure. And that is an initial payment. There were more that sort of were scheduled to come after that, which is very, very different to, for example, Treaty 6, which sort of offers an initial payment, I believe, of about $12 to each individual person sort of affected by that. This is sort of what that looks like when we talk about negotiating for different types of compensation. There's also very, very, very different sort of structures around what that is going to look like in terms of self-governance and what rights they have. So, for example, the Nisga'a claim covers surface and subsurface rights. So the Nisga'a maintain mineral rights for the land that they control. And that's really, really important because just ask any farmer in Alberta, most property owners don't have the mineral rights. So, for example, if you're a farmer in Alberta and an oil company discovers oil underneath your land, you don't get to say no. You don't get to say, no, that's my oil, don't take it out of the ground, because you have the surface rights, but not the subsurface rights, and the oil is subsurface, and the federal and the provincial government can grant that oil exploration company the right to put a well on your land, and you don't get to say anything because you don't have the subsurface rights. In order to prevent that kind of incursion on their own control of their land, the Nisga'a guaranteed subsurface rights for the land that they occupy. And then when we sort of talk about what that land looks like, this is also a very different sort of process. So we talked a little bit about the location of reservations where sort of this land was not optimal for agriculture and people didn't always sort of know what they were looking at, and the government was really trying to make sure that people were staying off of prime agricultural land that settlers would want, all of those sorts of things. And in general, the amount of land that was given was relatively small. So you're talking about an acre for a family of 5, for example, which is, if I remember the Treaty 6 terms correctly, what we're looking at. The Nisga'a claim gives the Nisga'a Authority access to 2,000 square kilometers, which are contiguous. So they're all in one place, right? 2,000 square kilometers all in one chunk. And that chunk is located to cover many, not all, but many of the sacred sites to the Nisga'a culture and people. And the intention in creating it that way, instead of in terms of reservations, was to ensure that the Nisga'a were better able to actually preserve their culture. And this is sort of one of the challenges about dealing with Indigenous Canada as a single category, because in a lot of ways, the populations of Indigenous people who lived on the West Coast um, tended to be less nomadic. The climate is better for it, so you don't really have to have a summer home and a winter home because, British Columbia is pretty temperate most of the year. You don't necessarily have to sort of move to follow large herds of migratory bison because the Great Bear Rainforest is a really rich source of pretty much everything you'd ever want to eat. So there's the cultural like adaptation to the environment is just a little bit different. But the idea of giving the Nisga'a 2,000 square kilometers was that they could have their clam beds and their mussels beds, and they could have their sort of traditional sources for medicine protected, because all of those were in relatively, not necessarily entirely, but in relatively the same area. So you can protect it all. And that was done with the intention of attempting to create a physical location, townships, that sort of thing, that would allow the protection of Nisga'a culture from a language perspective, in terms of business, in terms of creating sort of the ability to live a way of life. And if that sounds really familiar when we're talking, for example, about the preservation of francophones, this has sort of come up in our discussion boards a lot. That's very similar. The idea is not necessarily to give individual people a right to speak and learn French, but to give groups of people the ability to live in French or to live in an indigenous language, sort of, which is what's going on in the Nisga'a Claim. So that's some of the differences. I will also say that the Nisga'a have done some different things than other indigenous groups in the country, and that there are many indigenous groups who look at this settlement as a model, as something to aspire to in terms of resolving their own issues with the federal government. And then there are other indigenous groups who look at the Nisga'a and argue that they've sold out and that they have entirely abandoned any idea of meaningful collective indigenous rights. And one of the reasons for that is that if you remember, we were talking about this when we talked about sort of challenges on reserve, about indigenous families don't own their own homes, the bands own those, right? If you don't remember that, go back and look at infrastructure crises in our last week's videos, because that's sort of where we delve into that. The Nisga'a do this differently. So when we talk about the Nisga'a, they created the possibility, not the requirement, but the possibility of land privatization in 2013. And from their perspective, this was very much a part of being able to, again, build that environment where people could live in that culture, sort of an entire life that would be sort of prosperous, happy, whatever you sort of want to talk about in that way. And one of the things that they identified as a challenge in that process was that it was very, very difficult for indigenous members who were living on their land to do things like get loans to start businesses. It was very difficult to do that, for example, because the asset that most Canadians would use when they started a business would be taking out another mortgage on their home. That's sort of a very common way of doing that, but that's very difficult if you do not own your own home. Like if you don't own your home, and if you live in an environment where you actually can't own your home, it's not that like you chose to rent, it's that there's no way for you to own the house that you live in, even if you've lived in it for a really long time. So that sort of challenge prompted the Nisga'a to create some possibilities. There's a process that individuals can go through in order to sort of privatize and declare individual um, titles to land, such as it is in their community, and that with the idea that they can then use that title to get loans to start a business, to sort of develop economic sort of opportunities for other members of the community. There hasn't been a ton of sort of uptake on that. This isn't sort of something that's like, oh, everyone privatized it. But there are indigenous groups across the country who have argued. Sorry, let's go back to that. When we start talking about that sort of privatization, the Nisga'a's argument was that this was a way to lift people out of poverty, to sort of create that sort of sustainable economic opportunity for everyone by offering sort of the idea that, like, if one person starts a business and that in business then employs 10 people, then that single loan and that privatizing that single residence offers meaningful returns for sort of 10 different families across the community, and that's really valuable. The challenge is that once that land is privately owned, i.e., once that land is owned by the individual community or by the individual person or family who lives in that property, there's no way to ensure that it can only be sold, for example, to another member of the Nisga'a community. So when you grant title, you create a possibility for that land to be transferred to other people, to non-Indigenous people. And there has been a lot of conversation that that land in and of itself might be exceptionally valuable to any number of non-Indigenous buyers in ways that don't really respond to this idea. So one of the things about, for example, having the Nisga'a have 2,000 square kilometers of BC's west coast is that when you do that, the Nisga'a are working really hard to sort of ensure that that rainforest is beautiful and healthy and that the harbors are healthy and that there's whales. They're doing all kinds of conservation work like that, which means that if you, for example, wish to run a very, very, very exclusive, very, very, very high end wilderness retreat, for example, for deep sea fishing, for people to come get spa treatments, anything like that, you will pay a lot of money for that land because what surrounds it is so beautiful and so otherwise untouched, right? If you want to run something super exclusive, what you want is the one that you have to get in there by helicopter, and once you get there, there's no other resort around for miles and miles, because that's sort of the ethos, that's sort of the experience that you're going for, and that's really difficult land to find elsewhere because of the nature of the British Columbia coast being sort of largely a really beautiful area that people want to live and work on. The Nisga'a claim, the Nisga'a land provides this sort of like opportunity to do that. And so there's been some speculation that that's what's going to happen, that the second that land goes up for sale, those individual parcels of land, the small number of them, that they're going to be snatched up and that they're going to be combined and that it is going to be sort of a long process of transferring essentially that entire claim out of the hands of Indigenous people it was designed to benefit and into the hands of very wealthy people who want to build pretty houses in pretty environments. And so there have been many Indigenous critics across the country who have argued that the Nisga'a have essentially forfeited any kind of collective right to land and culture in doing that, and that in doing so, they're dooming their own culture to sort of extinction because they've sort of eliminated the structures that allow for the preservation of a culture through treaty by focusing on those sort of shorter term economic issues. So not at all a simple question.